Welcome to the Landing Zone podcast. Real veterans, real stories, unscripted and unedited. And today we have U.S. Marine Corps veteran and author Armand Kinslow. Welcome, Armand.
Well, good morning, Lloyd, and thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's a privilege. So I got to let everybody know that how we got introduced. So we got introduced by the Landing Zone podcast episode number one. A guest, Kevin Horgan. Kevin's a retired UPSer and a fellow Marine Corps veteran, Armand. And I guess you guys met in training.
We did. We started our careers together back at the basic school, which is where all new Marine officers go for 6 months. And we were in the same, not only the same company, but the same platoon. So we got to know each other quite well. And then we lost track over the years. But then Kevin and a couple of the other Marines sort of reached out, started contacting people about 10 years ago. And we had a big reunion. And since then, Kevin and I have been very close. We communicate often. And he, by the way, as a fellow author, he has been extraordinarily helpful and just a great mentor and guide through this process, having written 4 books himself. And as this is my first work, he was just really, as I say, extraordinarily helpful and wonderfully supportive through this 2-year process.
Yeah, mine was pretty quickly. Yeah, when I wrote my book,
Sure.
but Kevin was absolutely a mentor for me, and honestly instrumental in me writing the book. So, Kevin, I know you're listening. Thank you. Thank you for the support. You've always supported me, and for Armand and Vetlanta and veterans and their families. So, Armand, let's talk a little bit about your military service. What did you do in the Marines, and how long were you in the Marines?
Yeah. So was in a total between my active and reserve time, 24 years. I retired in 2005. I originally came in as an infantry officer. I was with the 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines out in Hawaii. And at that time, 3rd Marines were responsible for all of the Western Pacific deployments. And so my first deployment, actually, I found myself in the Persian Gulf when the hostages that were being held by the Iranians, that crisis was still ongoing. And of course, we thought that was going to be a big, a big deal. So we were practicing various types of operations if the hostages weren't going to be released. But then, of course, what we found out years later that they were just holding on to them until President Reagan had been inaugurated. Because they wanted to finally embarrass, President Carter through that whole, evolution. So that was a pretty exciting way to, start one's career. And after I served several years in the infantry, I decided to move over into the intelligence field, and I liked that a lot. It seemed to be something that was, conducive, to my nature and my experience and some of my education. And so I ended up staying in the intelligence business through the rest of my career. I served in Europe. I served back here in Washington a number of years. I was sent to Desert Storm as a member of a small hand-picked contingency representing the National Security Agency, actually, where I was at the time. To beef up their intelligence section. And so we worked right next door to the war room where General Schwarzkopf during that conflict made all his major decisions. And that was pretty exciting, being able to participate in that conflict, at the very highest level and see, how all those, decisions were being made between the ultimate commander and the guidance he was getting from Washington, et cetera. So then I got back. I went to work as a government civilian in the intelligence community. I did that for about 8 years, and then eventually ended up going with an organization that is a research arm of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And so then for the next 23 years, I did research in IT. And then about the last 10 to 15 years, broke off into the cybersecurity area since that got to be so popular and so hot. And then recently stepped back from that at the beginning of this year. So I could devote myself full time to the book and get it out the door.
Outstanding. So, did you ever get to meet the General Schwarzkopf?
I did. I did. We worked right next to him. I remember when General Powell and Dick Cheney at the time, who was Defense Secretary. I remember when they came and visited yeah. So it was a pretty exciting, pretty wild time. I was just a captain, at the time, just sort of one of the guys, but we were responsible for preparing his daily brief, and he would take intel briefings twice a day. So we had to, we were on a cycle to sort of put those things together, and it was kind of interesting because my particular discipline, signals intelligence, provides a lot of really the core and the basis of a lot of information that gets rolled up that goes into those briefings. But one of the sort of humorous things was, we always had to have pictures, so the imagery guys would, come over and say, okay, what pictures are we going to show the general that, as part of, and so you had a story that you'd put together every 12 hours, but then you had to kind of bend it a little bit to go with whatever pictures you had, because you can't go in and not show picture, so that was just a lot of little quirky,
Yeah.
sort of things that you remember about, about that experience.
So let's start into the book. So I got the book. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much. I
Oh,
haven't had
absolutely.
the opportunity to read it cover to cover yet, but I've
Hmm.
been really impressed with it. So I know the book didn't start off as a book. It started off as some research in your family. Can you walk our viewers in how it started?
Yeah. So in 2019, my son, who's been living overseas for a number of years, we were having our weekly conversation, and he said, Dad, we really don't have a lot of information about our family. It's just kind of the way things worked out. We had virtually no records on my father's side, and we had some oral tradition on my mother's side. And he said, I'd really like to know more about our family and where we came from and what our origins were and our ancestors. So he began in earnest in 2019. And then as we sort of got into COVID and, there wasn't a lot to do, I really started to get interested. And as we found a veteran through that genealogical research, I started to really pull the thread on what that veteran's experience was, what his unit was, where, tried to figure out what the movements and what military activities he was engaged in. So I initially created a PowerPoint, which is, how unfortunately we tend to communicate in the military these days. I mean, it was never meant for that. I think it's a highly abused, piece of gear, but it just seems to be the way, we all communicate. But the problem with that I found was that there was so much additional information that I had found so much richness in these stories that it was just a wholly inadequate vehicle to tell, to really give these stories justice. So the last a year ago summer, the Veterans Administration, interestingly enough, has this arts festival and competition that they have, and it's nationwide. They do it at the state level, and so as one of the artistic entries that you can make, there's visual art, there's sculpture, there's music, poetry, there was creative writing. And so that was really the impetus for me to actually sit down and try to put some of this information into a story. So I wrote one of the stories about my great uncle who had been on the USS California during the battleship during the Second World War and saw some significant action. And wrote that story and entered it into the contest. They read it at this public forum festival. I got a lot of positive encouragement, and so I thought to myself, well, I think I can actually do that, and so that set me off on then researching the other stories to the degree that I could actually put them all together, and then there were one or two wars that I hadn't covered. I had to do a little bit more digging to find a veteran, and sure enough, there I found a veteran family, so that I was able to cover the entire period from the Revolution, our War of Independence, all the way through Vietnam, and came up with these 12 short stories.
Yeah, incredible, and it's just so neat. Can you run us through the first one, the Revolutionary War?
Absolutely. So there was a German family who came over in the early 1700s, and they settled outside of Winchester, Virginia. They were the Stevens family, and the little community, the little bedroom community at the time outside of Winchester was called Stevensburg. Today, it's just called Stevens, Virginia. And my veteran's grandfather was the original patriarch of that group, and so his grandson, the grandfather had fought the French Indian War, and his grandson Jacob was called up into the Virginia militia, Western Virginia militia, and served 3 tours. At that time, mostly involved with conflicts with the Tories, with the British out in that area. Later, after the war, he migrated over into Tennessee and eventually settling in the state of Missouri, down in Madison County, which is in the upper part of the Missouri Ozarks, not far from the Mississippi River, and that's where he eventually died and was buried. And what was particularly interesting about his story is that at the time, in the I believe it was the 1790s, Congress passed a law that allowed for pensions to veterans of men who served directly with Washington. And a number of years later, they passed a second act, and they widened that number of men to include all men that were in the regular army. And then eventually, in 1832, they made a second amendment to that act that opened it up to militia. And at that point, then, is when my sixth great grandfather, Jacob Stevens, qualified for a pension. And so there's a very detailed record of his application for the pension. And so how I decided to write that story was a lawyer, a fictional lawyer, coming and arguing before a panel for that man's, for that man's veteran pension, for that veteran's pension. That was eventually granted, and he received per annum $30, which I think is about $1,000 a month, or $1,000 a year, I think, in today's dollars. And so that was that was his story, and it was interesting tracing him through the various states, because how did this man who originated in Virginia really end up in Missouri, where most all of the stories take place. 10 of the 12 veterans all originated in that area of the Ozarks,
Well, that's pretty neat.
in Missouri. Yeah.
Hey, let's talk about the Civil War, because the fascinating thing is you have two relatives that one fought for the North and one fought for the South, and they were actually at the same battle at the same time.
Yes, that really got me curious. As a young boy growing up in St. Louis, we would go down and visit some relatives at that north end of the Ozarks. That's on my mother's side of the family. That patriarch came down from French Canada and settled at a fort near just south of St. Louis, Fort Kaskaskia, and was part of the militia at that time. He um, eventually migrated down south, and then that's really how the family got their roots and stayed in the Ozarks. But when I started then looking at the Civil War period, I found these two men who lived relatively close to one another, but yet had fought on opposite sides. One fought for the North, and one fought for the South. And so I was extremely curious about how these basically these neighbors, how that all came about. And then, of course, you started to peel back a lot of interesting history about what was happening in Missouri prior to the war. Of course, many people are familiar with the Compromise of 1850, but the Missouri Compromise, but they really don't know a lot about that 1850 period where there was a tremendous amount of European immigrants, many Germans that came into the country and settled St. Louis along the Missouri River in the center part of the state. Brought, of course, beer and wine making with them from Europe, and so that's very, very popular now these days in that area. And so, how did these two men who again were neighbors, how did they end up on on opposite sides? And so the one veteran, the man who fought for the South, that was a fairly um, interesting but straightforward engagement at this battle. That was the beginning of Sterling Price's campaign. So, just to set a little bit of context for those who enjoy Civil War history, it's late in 1864. We know that Robert E. Lee is all bottled up at Petersburg. We've got Sherman down going through Georgia, wreaking havoc through that part, cutting the South supply lines. And so the commander of what was called the Trans-Mississippi campaign, the Trans-Mississippi region, which I didn't really, even growing up there, know a lot about. There were basically these three theaters. There was all the stuff in the east, which many people know about because that's where all the big battles were. There was the Western campaign, but then everything west of the Mississippi was called the Trans-Mississippi Theater of Operations. That took in Missouri and parts of Texas and Arkansas, and then the Kansas Territory. And there was some pretty interesting things that was going on during the war at that time. So anyway, late in the war, we're in September of '64. The idea that commander Kirby Smith comes up with Sterling Price is that if we can have this big raid from Arkansas up into Missouri and just create a bunch of chaos, maybe the Union forces will migrate, take some troops away from the east, and bring them out to battle us and quell this chaos. And that was the idea. Some historians think that Kirby Smith really wasn't, that much behind, that idea, but he really didn't have anything to lose because they really didn't think much of Sterling Price at the time. He's a very interesting character and comes across in several of my stories as a War of 1812 veteran, Mexican American War veteran that I had a relative participate in, and then of course he's comes back governor of Missouri, and then is involved in the early campaigns there in 61, 62. So they go out and they start gathering up guys. Some of them are volunteers. Some of them are actually pressed into service by force under penalty of death to fight. And so he's able to cobble this force of somewhere between 12 and 15,000 men together. And this first major engagement that they have is at a place called Pilot Knob Mountain, or Fort Davidson. It's about 90 miles south of St. Louis. And the fort was the end of a railroad, because one of the mountains is where they mined iron, and so that uh, the results of that mining operation, would go up to St. Louis to forgeries and you know be put into use. And so there was weapons and ammunition and food that they really needed for this raid. Because interestingly enough, a third of these men that he had gathered together, many of them didn't have weapons. Some of these guys didn't even have shoes, and here they are, sort of, trailing along with this large force, and so they really needed to take that fort. And the man on the other side, the Union man, he was local. He was just barely 16 at the time. And so when the call went out to, gather all the local men who were northern leaning at the time to defend the fort, because they knew uh, Price was putting this big raid together and coming up there, that's how he ended up in the defense of the fort, when the other great grandfather was part of that military force that was actually came in and attacked it. And what's particularly interesting, when I started doing the research on that battle, that I had known a little bit about when I was growing up, but it wasn't until the 90s when the state came in and really did some proper um, um, work around that site, and put a proper visitor center there, and they had a full-time interpreter there, and really made it a wonderful uh, site of historic significance that people could then really understand what happened. Um, when I started, really delving into that, I remember the park interpreter telling me, this is the best documented, least known small battle of the Civil War. And so there was no real shortage of information about the conflict, which was good. I read every book, every article, some things that were unpublished that I found in some local archives and stuff, to really get a sense of what happened, so that I could try to piece together the idea that, okay, both of these men were from the area. Did they fight at the battle? Yes. Were they there at the same time? Yes. Were they actually at the exact same place at the same time where they shot at each other? Maybe. I couldn't actually get to that point to where I could definitively say, that they, eyeball to eyeball kind of thing. But they were definitely there. And then, as we all do in historic fiction, where we take a lot of solid facts and then we create some characters and a little bit of dialogue to make the stories interesting. I mean, that's the real knack of storytelling. And then tell those two stories about those two men.
Yeah, very, very cool. Did both of them make it through the war?
They did. In fact, every one of my veterans, even though they incurred the sting of battle, were not mortally wounded during the battle. However, several did die shortly after their military service. But every man did survive his military experience.
Yeah, that's outstanding. So I'm not going to go over any additional stories because we want people to buy the book. But let's
Absolutely.
let's talk about the process of writing the book. Is there any advice that you can share to prospective authors out there?
There is a little bit. I mean, again, I mirrored a lot, as I'm sure you did, of what Kevin had shared with us, and that is to be disciplined. Try to do a little bit every day. Of course, life experiences get in the way, but I tried to emulate that that discipline about doing something on the book every day for 2 or 3 hours, either research or writing or rewriting or um, trying to put that all together. I think the other thing too is, and I just came up against this over the weekend. Common friend we were visiting, and he said, this woman that we both know, she's done a bunch of research on her family, and she has all this information, but she doesn't know what to do with it. And I said, well, my first bit of advice would be to her, what is the story that you want to tell? Decide the what, and then the how will, as you get started, almost reveal itself. But I think that's most important in the case of these 12 stories, where we have 12 different veterans that are involved. I tried to come up with a one word idea that would be the touchstone of each story. So, for example, is this a story about courage or friendship or purpose, humility, duty, sacrifice, faith, wisdom? And so I always kept that word and that idea in mind as I was telling the story of that particular veteran, because it's not just about the facts, or he was in this unit, or he went there, here, or there. And the reality is, and one of my friends who reviewed the book, was kind enough to review the book, shared this with me. He said, you not only were able to talk about the actual, some of the actual battle experiences, but also give a glimpse into just some of the mundaneness that we all experience in the military. It's not all that uh, you, you know combat, or
Yeah.
in fact, very few of us really actually get to participate in an activity where we get to practice our craft for many years, and then here we are. Okay, this is the big party. This is it, where it's going to happen. And so I tried to, in some of the cases, capture a little bit of that. Well, this is routine. A lot of it is training or drill, or moving from point A to point B. A lot of movement and logistics in the early, in some of the early stories of the 18th century, just getting men and material, from point A to point B, kind of a thing. And so, what was that like in the Mexican American War story? The unit starts out, they muster at Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, but then they have to march all the way out to Santa Fe. And so, there's a lot about those experiences of just what they encounter on the march, and what they do to keep sort of keep that keep that unit interested and together. And interestingly enough, I did not know this. I'm sure many historians do, but in militia units, you actually elect your leaders, and at any point in time, it's almost like a British system where you can call for like this no confidence vote, and vote a guy out of a leadership position, which I thought was fascinating from the standpoint that, okay, now you're going to be leading volunteers in a way that is almost similar to if you're the head of a nonprofit organization, where you have volunteer, and you can't just come in as like you would in the Marines or the Air Force and say, okay, I'm in charge, and all right, everybody, put the toes on the yellow line, and this is what we're going to do today. No, it's a lot subtler, and it's a lot more um, soft glove, I guess, in terms of the leader. So I found that in a couple of the organizations where they had militia volunteers, rather fascinating, thinking about what, how that leadership of those men, those officers, and those non-commissioned officers, had to be very different than a traditional military model.
Yeah, but I really like the part about the mundane. as an enlisted aviator, we used to have this saying: flying is hundreds of hours of boredom followed by seconds of sheer terror.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the advice I would give, and the advice I learned is get a good editor. I know, yeah, your wife is an English major and she did the editing for you. I learned that from. In fact, I'm getting ready to launch a second version of my
Mm,
book that has been re-edited. So get a good editor, somebody who is either in the business, an English major, or and make sure they make the investment, and because it will pay off. So then one of the things I learned, Armand, is writing the book is easy. Watching Kevin Horrigan at work, it's selling the book, which takes a lot of work, and I loved writing it. I'm selling it was very different for me.
yeah, I agree. Comparatively, I'd say there were three. I'd say there were three stages, and you already talked about two: writing, editing, but then promoting.
Yeah.
And again, as you said, I was incredibly fortunate. My wife is just an amazing editor, amazing talent. I mean, she's done so many, great things throughout her career. She's taught collegiate English, collegiate grammar, edited, wrote National Science Foundation grants and whatnot. So to have that in-house resource was just, extraordinary. However, I many times I felt like I was back in grade school where I'd write something and what do you think? Hand it in for a grade and get it back with, red ink all over it and, go try it again kind of thing. But it was all in, it was all in love and, in good spirit. And even with Kevin, I mean, as we got in the later stages and I'd say, here you go, Kevin, what do you think about this story? Or even send him the whole manuscript. And I mean, he was just amazing. I mean, he's got real talent. He studied English in school um, before he got in the Marines, and I think Kevin's a wonderful writer. And he was just, no BS. I mean, here's what I think. This you didn't quite make it here. I changed this or whatever. Um, Not like, let's say, if you're a teacher and you're working with students and you say, well, maybe you should consider, or yeah, it was none of that. It was like, okay, do that. This doesn't work. Do this. Change the, which I really appreciated because at that point, I'd ask them for their feedback. So I wasn't sensitive or defensive about any of that. So that was phase two.
Yeah.
And then I just had a completely unrealistic idea about what the role of even when you're self-publishing, of what their role was going to be. I thought, oh, I got the manuscript, it's ready to go. I hand it over to you. It's Miller time. I get books back, and then no, 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 no. You are much more involved in the process. Everything from, okay, tell us what your search engine optimization
Yeah.
terms are going to be for Google, and I'm like, what the F is that? And so I'm Googling,
Yeah.
how to do that, or, okay, here's your copyright
Yeah.
application, figure that, so it was a lot more involved. But
I agree. So
I yeah. So
so yeah.
and then the whole sales angle of being being a bit of a self promoter, to get people interested.
Yeah. So Kevin gave me some wise advice too. So
Mm,
I I gave him my what I thought was my final book, and
mhm,
after he had checked several of the chapters, and I was on my way to Grand Cayman that spread my late wife's ashes, and
mm,
I gave Kevin the book. I'm like, here, in case something happens to me, here's the book, and then please, read it and let me know what you think. And
mhm.
I came back, and he goes, "This is amazing, but you got one more chapter to write." and he was absolutely true. It was
Mm,
something was missing, and I I wrote the final chapter. And
Hmm.
then one of the things that Kevin, when I first got to know Kevin, I would run into him at bookstores all over the place.
Mm.
And there was no having a social conversation with Kevin when he was signing books.
Oh yeah.
It was all about selling books. And,
Right.
and if you walked into a Barnes and Noble and made eye contact with Kevin, you were going to be able to walk away. He was using
Right.
a Marine Corps approach, and I thought it was really really good.
Yeah.
So your book, how can folks buy it?
Amazon, if you just put in the title of the book, They Will Not Be Forgotten, and my name, boom, it'll come right up. It's retails less than $15, so it's a wonderful holiday gift as we're coming into the holidays, stocking stuffer. Um, please consider it as a gift for the veteran or the military historian or the genealogist or just a family member who would like to learn a little bit more about our nation's history. It's an easy read. If you sat down, went stem to stern, you could blow through it in 3 hours. The 12 stories vary in length from 1,000 words, which would take you maybe about 8 minutes, to 3,300 words, maybe 12 to 13 minutes if you just sat down and read it. Um, the idea being that maybe you keep it on the nightstand, and before you go to bed at night, maybe you just read one short story, and then you're able to reflect on that before. So it's a pretty easy read at about 38,000 words. So Amazon, also Barnes and Noble, but Amazon's really the best and easiest way to get it.
Great, and I highly encourage everybody to leave a review on Amazon after you read it. And so, Armand, is there a second book, or was this a one-time thing?
I've got about three other ideas, and as a Marine, sometimes we can get very focused and wrapped up into the accomplishment of the mission that we are on today. And of course, as you were just sharing with Kevin, my mission now is to promote and sell books. But I've decided that as we roll into the new year, I'm going to start to ramp down on those kinds of activities and start the next project. And I have several ideas, a couple historic fiction ideas. I have a crime drama novel, modern times, that I'm toying with. So maybe peel off into a completely different genre and try my hand at that. But I think at this juncture today, I've got at least three more books in me, and
Oh,
so
that's great.
I'm I'm going to be and now that I'm much more familiar with the process end to end, I know exactly what to expect, and so I think this is going to be a big part of my next phase of life now that work is doesn't require all of that time, energy, and effort.
Well, very cool. So, hey,
Yeah.
Armand, thank you for appearing on the landing zone. And I want to take this opportunity to wish you and our viewers a very Merry Christmas and a happy holidays, happy and safe New Year. And I'm going to end this podcast like I always end it. Be safe, be kind, and be real.